Today we will hear a review of One Giant Leap, The Impossible Mission That Flew Us to the Moon by Charles Fishman. Publishers Weekly says, quote, Fishman's knack for explaining science and engineering and his infectious enthusiasm for Apollo's can-do wizardry make for a fascinating portrait of a technological heroic age. Our presenters today are Dr. Jen Connolly, lecturer, School of Physics and Astronomy at RIT, and she is joined by her student, Amber Dubill. Please join me in welcoming them to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are we? You like Apollo 11?
Yes.
I have some 3D models that my students printed for me, alongside a Lego Saturn V that Amber has brought for us and put all together for us. I'm going to have our little props hanging out for the duration, and we'll have a seat here and chat.
The slides up.
Dr. Jen Connolly. I'm a lecturer in physics and astronomy at RIT. I've been there about 7 years. And for many of those years, I've been pleased to know Amber.
I'm Amber Dubill, and I'm a former NASA intern. I'm currently my 5th year at RIT in mechanical engineering.
So I come at this book from a very general astronomy perspective, but Amber comes with a lot of insider information. Having worked at NASA and having quite a passion, as you might be able to detect, maybe, just a scotch. And I think in general, I just wanted to ask, has anyone in the audience read this book yet? We have a few. And just a thumbs up, thumbs sideways, I didn't even have to go on, because there were 2 big thumbs up. So I think for Amber and I, we both enjoyed a lot of the detail in this book, and there were sort of strong points and maybe some weaker points. And we also wanted to give you some additional visuals, because the book has some beautiful images in it, and maybe not used to the strongest effect everywhere, and maybe there are some visuals lacking. So we're going to talk about all that here. So just starting off from the strong points for me, I learned many things I did not know about both the historical context of Apollo and the details. And there was a beautiful balance between individual stories, anecdotes about a person, and the broader context of what was happening leading up to Apollo and then through kind of the Apollo era. So that was one big plus from my point of view.
So I would say that really, if I had to sum up the strongest point in this book is perspective. It gives a lot of different perspectives that people, in the public don't always think about, or people in the scientific community don't even think about. And then, honestly, like we had talked about the political part of this because it was the 60s, and obviously the Cold War was happening. So for me, there was a really awesome change of perspective that I don't think is very much conveyed when talked about the space race and the Apollo era.
Yeah, and a few other things that we noticed was that there was contention built into the political side of things, as Amber just mentioned, and seeing some of that firsthand. There are a lot of quotes in the book, a lot of very direct, sort of journalistic approach to most of the topics, and then these sort of tangents, which I think we want to get to next. So the tangents. So sometimes the author seems to be driving at a point and then gets very distracted. And I have to admit that as a lecturer, I may have done this myself on occasion. Amber's shaking her head no, but she's been in my classes. She knows that I do it too. So on the one point, people in glass houses, right? I shouldn't throw stones, but there are times in the book that you kind of get lost, and the drive of how immense the program, the Apollo program was, gets sort of muddled because now we're off. There's a long section, for instance, on atomic bombs. And on the one hand, it's all really interesting, powerful information. On the other hand, it's not clear what the point is in terms of driving this storyline along. So that's one warning for me, but this also leads to a stronger point of the book that we didn't just mention, which is that this is a great coffee table book. You can set it on your table and pick it up and read 10 pages and go, oh, neat. That's so cool. I didn't know that. Wow. And then put it down and go away for a month and pick it up again, and it's fine. You haven't completely lost the plot. You're not confused about what's happening because there's a lot of repetition. And so the repetition in the book is, I think, a pro and a con. Because, for instance, I was listening to the book. I got an audio version as well. So I read the book and then I listened to it. And I was listening to it with a friend who is an astronomer. She works at Lincoln Lab up in Boston. And she's like, oh, if he says Sputnik one more time. Right? One more time. Just say Sputnik one more time. And on the one hand, yes, super important, very, very pivotal moment that set us into that space race was the launching of Sputnik. And it became a very much communist versus capitalist fight. And that's what drove Apollo. What we'd love to think, I think, looking back, is that this was about our wonder and our ambition to get to the moon and about the science. But the book does a good job of telling you it wasn't really about the science. Most of what was accomplished with Apollo, we could have accomplished without having crewed missions. We could have had robotic missions to do most of what was accomplished. It wasn't about that. It was about beating the Russians. And we did. And we poured an immense amount of money and time and resources in general into doing that. And the book also does a good job of telling you how many industries were grown or how many specific companies went from being pretty good at making what they were making to exceptional. Because the quality of what they had to produce to go into Apollo was so much higher than anything that they'd done before. So I liked the big picture, but at times there were these tangential pieces or repetition that got a little bit old, that made me want to kind of put the book down and come back to it later. So those were some of the sticking points for me personally.
So I'll say one of my favorite parts of the book is they talk about the flag, and I'm not going to ruin anything about, if you want to read the book. But they talk about putting a flag on the moon, and everyone thinks that's just such a, that we did that, and, they must have thought about that and all that stuff. Well, you find out that's not exactly what happened. But that is such an awesome part, and there's other little things in the book, other stories, they talk about this loose soldering on Apollo 12. There's all these really short, little, awesome stories that, someone who knows a lot about, the Apollo program and space missions and how they usually go, I was still finding interesting and learning a lot. But my problem that I had a little bit is, when we talk about those tangents, there was, I think we said 90 pages worth of just on the computer, the guidance navigation system of the Apollo mission. Now, yes, that part was instrumental to doing what we could do, and he makes that point, but sometimes he kind of doesn't land it that well. It seems more like it's just a tangent. Unintended. Pun intended. Oh. He doesn't land it that well. It's kind of he mentions it like, this is what made it happen. This is why we could do all that. But he doesn't land it well, and it just seems like a big tangent. And 90 pages is like a third of the book. So I would have liked to see, there's also a lot of things that he doesn't talk about. And we always kind of mention this. Obviously, we're two women up here talking about space. And I think he mentions women once in the book. He even talks about NASA Langley, which is where, if people are familiar with Hidden Figures And he talks about the guidance navigation stuff. He's talking about lunar orbit rendezvous, which is what they ended up doing, and how that, the proponent of that was at Langley. And what they were doing in Hidden Figures and all those women were doing the calculations and the math and everything for these computers and for those types of trajectories. So, and he doesn't mention them once in the entire book. The only time he really mentions women is when they're talking about how they made the computers and how they made the software. They actually had women who threaded wires, which was actually pretty interesting. But still, there's a lot of stuff that I think he missed out on when you talk about the Apollo era, when you talk about the lunar program. There's so much that there's little stories that he could have told, which he told some of those little stories, which, again, I thought those were fantastic, the flag stuff, even talking about how the software was knitted. I thought that was awesome as well. But he missed, even besides the point of where are the women in this book, he doesn't really talk that much about the Gemini missions, the Mercury missions. He mentions Surveyor and some of the unmanned missions once or twice, but even then he doesn't talk a lot about that either. It's really Sputnik. We start, we kind of mention Mercury and Gemini and all that. We mention the Russians, then Apollo 1 cabin fire, and then bam, we're at Apollo 8. Well, where's the rest of that? The timeline is not there. What did you think about the timeline?
Yeah, so I thought this book was chronologically disorienting. I think if you have the benefit of nostalgia and having lived through it, it might be a little easier to navigate this book. I think it was harder to keep track of what was happening because he'd throw a date at you. And he might have mentioned the context 3 chapters before, but then gone completely away from that. And I think a little too much effort from the audience was expected in keeping track of where you were, especially because we went from Apollo 1 to Apollo 8 to Apollo, I think, 14, and then 11. I was trying to track it the other day. I was going to create a map, but I decided it was not worth trying to track it because he'd get so excited about a particular story, and off he'd go. Chasing that ball, if you didn't know when that ball was dropped, it was a little less impactful. I had to keep reminding myself, wait, what was going on? Okay, this is post this and before that. And it would have really helped, I think, to orient the reader throughout more intentionally, personally. So yeah, the chronology is a little weird. But again, if you put it down and pick it up a month later, you haven't lost anything because he's not assuming you know where he is. So on the one hand, again, good coffee table book. I thought a very good coffee table book because I tend to be a reader. I eat books, so I want to read at long stretches and just marvel at things. And if I'm too busy going, wait, hang on, 1970, it's okay, wait, which one, where are we? Both in the social context in the US, which he does a good job of mentioning on occasion. How was the public feeling about what was happening? Because the scientists were not behind Apollo. The scientists were saying, there are other great things we should be doing right now, instead of focusing on this one singular thing. And the public initially also wasn't terribly excited about putting a lot of money into it. But that changed over time. And so where you enter the story is very important to know whether or not this is a moment that public sentiment is, yes, let's go. And here's the money, and we support Congress apportioning all of this. Or whether it was one of the times we were facing some backlash. There's a great quote in the book about the American attention span. That essentially he says, it hasn't changed. We like to make jokes today about, we have about 30-second attention spans in the US. We did back then too. And so there's a story about, well, the first person to walk on the moon definitely goes to the White House and gets the full-blown treatment. The second person doesn't, right? That sounds very, very topical right now. That sounds like something we're still struggling with in this country. So knowing exactly what part of the story you're in is important. Is this a moment where the public is back behind us and we're supporting this and we think NASA is the best? Or are we going, what are these people doing? You're wasting all this money. JFK appears in the book a lot for obvious reasons, but JFK didn't care about the science and actually didn't care much about space. And there's a chapter on the secret space tapes. Space tapes, the secret space tapes. So the idea was there were a number of major catastrophes in the White House along these decades that the Apollo program was running. And there were several presidents who recorded conversations in the Oval Office and other meeting rooms. Kennedy did it too. And Kennedy chose when the tapes were turned on and off, and there were several conversations that the tapes were on for that had to do with the Apollo missions. And he says quite bluntly, it should be your top priority, and that is because we have to beat the Russians. That's it. So from a historical perspective, it's very interesting to look back and say, wow, politics drove all of this, because we're in the 50th anniversary. There's so much wonderful nostalgia around landing, and it's easy to kind of rewrite history and say, we just did this because we thought space was the next frontier. We wanted to learn so much about it. Well, it's actually the Russians thought it was the next frontier, and then we were stuck with that decision. And there were previous presidents saying, I think this is a complete waste of funds and energy, and we shouldn't be doing this. So again, knowing exactly where you were, what moment, what was happening with the political landscape, public support, the money flow, all of that is very important, I think, to get the impact of the story, and the author didn't always do that particularly well, in my opinion. The other thing we thought about, which maybe we can help with a bit, is that the author used images. They're fantastic images from the Apollo era, but there were no, as Amber said, infographics, which showed you big picture. So they're just individual shots of people and places, lovely, but they're not placed when he's talking about those people or places. They're just stuck in random sections of the book. And there are no big picture items. So we want to move to that next, unless anybody has any questions right this moment. Ready for some big picture? Okay. So, there we go. So I'm going to back up a little bit. So the big picture here is, where did we actually land? Can you see? Thank you, perfect. So the stars on this map are where we actually landed missions. And you'll notice there are a lot of numbers missing because a lot of the Apollos didn't land, right? Not just 1 through 8, but you'll notice we go 11, 12, 14. We all know the Apollo 13 story. That's in the public record over and over again, and we've had some great films about that recently. And then we go 14, 15, 16, 17. We nailed all of those. So you can see the Apollo 13 missing in this sequence, and you can see we landed at different places. And he sort of mentions moon features occasionally, but there's no concept of where those actually lay. So we wanted to include this. The next thing is the actual route for Apollo 11. He talks, as Amber mentioned, he spends about 90 pages on the navigation system in the computer, which was astonishing work, but he never gives you a sense of the actual flight path or what's happening during that path. So there are little figures as you move through this, and we have our scale models here of those different stages. So we start with the Saturn V rocket, and then we end up with the little LEM, and things separate, but he talks about those and never tells you what they are. So I'm going to ask Amber to give us a really quick overview of what's going on here.
So when you see these trajectories, the one is going to the moon and the one is coming back, actually. And if you notice, so the Saturn V is actually 3 stages. If you take it apart, that does actually come apart, but we might not want to take it apart because we do have a slide on the different stages. But it's actually 3 stages. And then on top of that, if you notice right around, I mean, they're labeled here, but right around like 7, 8, 9, 10, which is more toward the Earth, which is more toward me, you notice the whole thing separates, then turns around and rendezvous back to each other, and then like does a 180 and then goes and pushes itself that way. Then it lands on the moon, and all the dash lines are where we don't have communication with the Earth. So everything has to be done on the spaceship, or obviously the spacecraft, and you can't tell Mission Control what's going on, and Mission Control can't tell you what's going on because they're getting data back as well. As they talk a lot about what the computer actually gave to the astronauts. There's actually one of the cool things about that is what the computer actually, how it interfaced with the astronauts and what they actually put into the computer and saw. But then Mission Control would also tell them, hey, you need to, your numbers aren't looking correct, or hey, your numbers are looking correct, you're looking good. So you see that we turn around, then one person actually gets left behind in the lunar orbiter as 2 go down to Earth in the LEM. What?
Down to the moon.
Sorry, down to moon. And the LEM, or the Lunar Excursion Module, which we have right here. And then notice they actually leave a lot of it on the moon and then use engines that were actually developed in Buffalo, New York by Bell Aerospace. The Lunar Excursion Module Ascent engines. And actually blast off, rendezvous back, and this is called lunar orbit rendezvous, is the method of this. And they actually have a really big section about how this was a point of contention for the Apollo program. And scientists were actually fighting with each other, walking out of meetings, disregarding each other, straight up like yelling at each other about how to do this, or if this was the correct way to do this. And then so they rendezvous in space. That's why the third person has to get left up in the orbiter, attach, and then come back to Earth and re-enter. And that is a feat of itself. And I'm saying they probably came back with, if you look at all of this mass that it took to launch like people into space, they came back with about that. So it takes a lot of mass to get up there, and then you don't come back down with nearly as much as you get. So then these are the different stages of that. So at the bottom you have the F1 engines, and this picture is actually kind of nice because it shows the contractors that actually were in charge of this. People think, oh, NASA made this. Well, NASA didn't make that. They contracted a company to make that, and they oversaw the design and the implementation. So the book actually does a really good job of explaining that kind of, and talking about the different companies that went into that. So again, you can kind of see the different stages, and really everything you don't return to Earth, you just let it fall into the ocean. Jeff Bezos actually went and found like the Saturn V rocket first stage that fell into the ocean, or just gets left out in space, or some of it actually gets left onto the moon. So I don't think he does a really good job in the book explaining that these are different stages, and this is how it all comes together. This is a size reference. If you have a picture of yourself in an F1 rocket engine, you kind of got to put it up there. So that's actually me inside the rocket engine. And then this is when it was developed at NASA Marshall. And speaking of that, we'll go there first. NASA Marshall is one of the 4 centers mentioned in the book. Does anyone know that there's actually 10 NASA centers? Does anyone actually know that? So I worked at Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. And they're also named different things. There's space flight centers, there's space centers, and there's research centers. And they all have different functions and work on different things. So you can see at the bottom, there's NASA Langley in Hampton, Virginia, and that's where they trained the Apollo astronauts to walk in zero G. They used to hang them by this huge hangar. It's called the gantry. There's Mission Control that everyone recognizes from Houston, obviously out in Texas. That's the Johnson Space Center. And then at the bottom right, everyone knows this one. It's in Florida, right? It's Cape Canaveral. It's the Saturn V rocket ready for a launch on 39A.
on the launch pad. And then the other one mentioned is actually what I just said, Marshall Space Flight Center. That's actually in Huntsville, Alabama, and they're mostly in charge of the rocket engines and actually building the Saturn V rocket. So I went back one, but
Yeah, so I want to thank Amber for giving us that context, because I struggled myself in the book, because he does talk about how this injection of money into the industrial sector grew not just the NASA centers, of which we have 10 now, but also many, many companies. And so that is mentioned, but not in a cohesive manner. It's not put together so that you can see the pieces of the puzzle. And for reference here, we have a whole series of rockets, and you can see on the right-hand side, that's the Saturn V, the largest one that we ever have made in the United States. So towards the end of the book, I hoped that this would lead into a next steps. How did Apollo set the stage for what NASA did next and what the space industry did next in the US? And personally, I felt it sort of fizzled. There was this beautiful story of how difficult things were and how we managed to solve amazing technical issues in a very short period of time. And we managed to safely land people on the moon, and we managed to get most of our astronauts home safe. And that's sort of it. And 50 years later, as an astronomer, I can tell you we're having another space race right now. A totally different kind of space race, where it's not government versus government. Now private industry, as Amber just mentioned, Jeff Bezos, who is in charge of Amazon, you might have heard of Amazon. He has a sizable fortune, and some of that he is pouring into space exploration. And then there's Elon Musk, you may have heard of that character, who owns Tesla and is an engineer's engineer, I think, who has poured his own fortune into a rival space company. SpaceX and Blue Origins are the two major industries, and NASA has started working with them and funding a lot of what happens through their companies. And we now have a revival of putting people in space, because for a long time what NASA turned to was robotic missions. So the Mars missions, which have been a resounding success, it took a lot of trial and error, but that's what space is, a lot of trial and error. So we had a lot of robotic missions and the Cassini probes and understanding our solar system in a very, very deep way over the last 5 decades. And he sort of doesn't build to that. So we've gone through this period where we were much more informed by the science and the science goals, which wasn't what happened with Apollo. Apollo was a political battle, and amazing science and technology came from it, and we built full industries through it. But the drive was not the science. And so we sort of shifted gears for a long time in the US to scaling back the amount we spend on space and driving towards our scientific goals differently. And now we have these two very charismatic people, private citizens, who are pouring their own money into putting people back in space. So 50 years later, this is the perfect time to talk about what does it mean to put people in space, what does it mean to colonize space, etc. I wished the book would have set that up a little bit. I wish there was like the teaser trailer at the end that would show you what's happening right now, because it's a really, really fascinating time. So on the one hand, I love the nostalgia of the book. The details, the stories are wonderful, but I don't want the public to walk away thinking, and that was it. And that is the US story of crewed spaceflight. That's all she wrote. Because right now, we're kind of writing the next chapter. We're in the midst of that right now. Is there anything you want to add?
I will just say, we're very familiar with the space race going on right now. And shout out to the last book review we did about a year ago. Thanks for having us back on Space Barons. And that was all about the private space industry and, comparing it to NASA. And I'm just glad to see a book that really, NASA's getting a lot of flack right now in that private space race. And as someone who's worked there, I think that that's undeserving. And as we talked about, there's a lot of really unmanned missions that are doing some great science, and we're learning so much. And the public view versus the internal view perspective, I think that NASA can do a better job of opening it up and saying, like, this is the things we're doing, and here's why they're so great. I was lucky enough to meet a former astronaut, Dr. Mae Jameson, a few weeks ago, and she gave a great talk on, NASA's problem is that they don't open. They're great at sharing information, but they don't explain why. And this book actually does touch on that. They don't explain why they're doing these things or why these things are important. And it's hard to get the public interested in what you're doing when they're like, okay, that's cool. There's some pretty pictures from space, but why are we spending money on this? Why are my tax dollars going to this? And, I was happy to have a book that wasn't ragging on NASA. It was like, hey, look, here's some awesome things that they did in such a short time. I was a little bit disappointed, as we said, it's not the end. Apollo was not the end, right? It moved into a different era of NASA. But as someone who's young and excited about the space industry, I was a little bit disappointed where it kind of, like we said, kind of fizzled out. And he was like, well, that was Apollo, and we did that, and then we didn't do anything worth noting after. But we did so many things worth noting, and we're still doing things worth noting. We're going to go back to the moon. And the Artemis missions, named like their twin brother Apollo, obviously. We try it. We're still going to Mars. We're still doing all this stuff. It's just, the public doesn't seem to see that. And for myself, that was a little bit disappointing overall. Very grateful to have a book that really does highlight the spirit of NASA.
So as Amber mentioned, a great follow-up book would be Space Barons. And we were lucky enough to come talk to this same room about that last year at roughly the same time. So if you read this and are left wanting more about what's happening now, that Space Barons is really an interesting one. So I want to open it up to questions now.